From Aeneas and Venus to Romulus and Mars, let's talk about the first king of Rome. Hello you funky people, Funky Monkey here, welcome and thank you for joining me today. I've mentioned them a few times now and I think it's high time we talk about the Roman kings, those who set in motion the wheels of history and helped shape what eventually became to be one of the most important empires in the history of the world, the Roman Empire. But before we had the Colosseum, before we had Circus Maximus, the Roman Aquila and the nigh unstoppable Roman legions, we had the Roman monarchy and the growing pains that the state experienced. Just as a heads up, this will be a multi-parter as there are so many fascinating things to talk about, things that I am sure were never taught to you in school. As I was researching this, I remembered why this was one of my favorite topics while in the university and how I wanted to do my bachelor's on the Roman monarchy and the early republic. It will be a little longer as there are so many interesting things to say, and I find it fascinating to share with you an extended version of the legend of the foundation of Rome. So, if you want to learn something super cool that is worthy of any fantasy story, stick around. But before we jump in, let's talk about the miniature I will be painting today. If you saw my previous video, you know what this is. If you haven't, this is a miniature I made from scratch using copper wires and air drying modeling paste. I wanted to go for a creepy, weird XCOM inspired creature and ended up with a lobster that could easily find a spot in Phoenix Point. Today, I will be painting this monstrosity, all the while talking about the founder of Rome and the first Roman king, so join me. It will be worth it. Now, let me tell you what my plans are with the miniature before we begin the story. I will start the painting process by applying a coat of Mod Podge mixed with black acrylic paint. I'm doing this because I want to make sure the miniature gets an extra coat of protection, although it is basically made of stone at this point, more or less. But as an extra bonus, this layer acts as a black primer, so I already know it will take paint very well. Once the Mod Podge is dry, I will come in with Administratum Grey for an intermediary highlight and then finish the zenithal priming with Pebeo White. Not sponsored by Pebeo or anyone, but I can't recommend the black and white paints enough. I will eventually try other colors as well, but these two are by far the best black and white I have. As you can see, I'm trying to avoid getting any color on the gears sticking out of the miniature as I want them to retain their metallic look and not have to come in later and clean them up. And I've added 4 vents that I've made by using 1 cm by 2 cm XPS foam bricks, squeeze their middles and use the toothpick to poke holes in them. Of course they need some encouragement before properly sticking to the miniature. I will play off the worn and battered look of the miniature and paint this bad boy in a weird fashion. In my mind, this biomechanical construct was created to take on very powerful individuals by a group of people that took on their gods and kinda won, so I don't mind the weird and alien look of the mini. Although it is okay, you can call a lobster, I don't mind. I will try to make it as weird and creepy as possible. Although the Mod Podge adds some protection to the miniature, while applying it I managed to snap off 2 of its tendrils, so that was fun, but now it looks creepier. I still don't have a name for it, so if you have any ideas feel free to leave them in the comments, you might inspire me. Oh, and I do recommend wearing some sort of gloves when using Mod Podge like this, as it does coat the skin very well. Now that you know what I'm going for, I am sure you already know it's not going to end up exactly as I want it to, but no matter. It is still a nice final result. Now, let's go through the pre-story checklist. I don't have any coffee, again, very late in the evening, I wanna sleep tonight, but I do have some very lovely fruit tea in my mousse cup. I have one of my lovely assistants in my lap, Potato, say hi. And I also have something for the soul. How about you? Are you all comfy, cozy and prepared to hear stories of gods, blood, gore, hopes, dreams and betrayals, and with something tasty to drink on hand? Perfect, then I think it's time for a story. There are a lot of myth and legend surrounding the kings of Rome, as there weren't many sources that talked about them even in imperial times. The few surviving sources are in the works of Titus Livius Patavinus, or Livy, ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city, and Plutarch, parallel lives. Livy boasted that he took all of his info from the state archives in Rome and from inscriptions that peppered the capital and the most prominent settlements in the Italian peninsula, combined with oral traditions. While Plutarch most likely took inspiration from Livy's work, seeing how he lived several decades after Livy actually published his works. But he would have also had access to the same sources Livy did. Because we only have a limited number of sources and they are very biased, we have hit a bit of a problem, but thankfully there are archaeological remains that have been unearthed that confirm some of the things we know from Livy. But please take everything with a grain of salt, as again, even for the Romans, some of the things might have seemed a little bit exaggerated. And this episode is about what the 1st century BCE Romans knew about Romulus, not necessarily a deep dive in the merits of the sources. Okay. If we are to start with the beginning, we first need to talk about where the Romans themselves believed their roots were. The legend says that after the Trojan Wars were over, there were only 2 pure-blood Trojan survivors scattered with the wind. These survivors were Aeneas and Antenor. They were spared because they were advocates for peace, and it was well known that they were of the opinion Helena should be returned to Menelaus, her husband, and thus opposed the war with the Greeks. So the Greeks spared their lives. They left Troy, or what was left of Troy, and sought out a new home for themselves. On their journey, they were accompanied by the Paphlagonians, one of the most ancient people who inhabited Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, traditional allies of the Trojans. Their king died before Troy defending it, and they were left without rulership and a direction. So they hitched their wagon to the last 2 pure-blood Trojans. Antenor and his group of companions disembarked on the coast of the Adriatic Sea, and they took the name Venetians. All of the settlements in that particular area were given Trojan names. Aeneas, on the other hand, initially stopped in Macedonia, then set sail for Sicily, and then disembarked on the coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea on the western coast of Italy. After a long voyage, they were left only with the weapons they bore and the ships they sailed. Thus, they started pillaging up and down the coast. Now, according to Livy, there are 2 legends of this moment. The first tells us that the local king, Latinus, gathered all those able to bear weapons and met the Trojans in battle. The king fell and his lands and people were conquered by Aeneas. Pretty straightforward story. The second legend, though, is more to the Romans' liking. Latinus brought his army on the field to face Aeneas and his host. Before engaging in battle, Latinus invited Aeneas to a parley and asked them who they were, where they hailed from, and what they wanted in his lands. Aeneas told him that they were survivors of Troy and that they had nowhere else to go. He was Aeneas, son of Anchises and the Greek goddess Aphrodite, or the Latin/Roman Venus. Impressed with the resolve Latinus saw in Aeneas' eyes, his origin and his ancestry, instead of engaging in battle, he extended his hand in friendship and swore an oath of kinship. The king's daughter, Lavinia, wed Aeneas, although she was promised to a prince of the Rutuli, a local tribe, by the name of Turnus, and they became one people. The Trojans built a city in their new land, and Aeneas called it Lavinium in honor of his new wife. Soon, they had a son whom they called Ascanius. The Rutuli prince, Turnus, of course, was offended by Latinus when the old king gave the hand of his fiancée to a foreigner, so he declared war. The battle was hard and grueling, but eventually Aeneas's and Latinus's armies were victorious. The price paid? Old King Latinus was slain in battle. The Rutuli, knowing that their army might not be enough, before going to battle, sought allies in the Etruscans and won them over. The Etruscans were concerned about a new city in Latinus's territory competing with their own cities, so it wasn't that much of an effort for Turnus to convince them join him in battle. The Rutuli and the Etruscan army united forces and set out against the newcomers. Aeneas, knowing that at this point there was a wedge between his people and those of Latinus, with the old king being dead and all that, and with the enemy armies encroaching on his new home, he decided to strengthen the bonds between his people and those of Latinus. And to do so, he gave them a common name and called them Latins, in honor of their old king. He introduced new laws, tightened the bonds, encouraging marriages and encouraging friendly competitions between the people that he brought with him and the locals, in showing more zeal and willingness to make things work. A noble sentiment, to be sure. He met the Rutuli and the Etruscan army in the field, although, according to Livy, they were more than able to resist a siege. But Aeneas wanted to send a message. They were here to stay no matter what. The Latins were victorious, but Aeneas fell in battle, a sacrifice that cemented the new union of people he created. He was buried beyond the river Numicius, and he was given the title Aeneas Jupiter Indiges. As a side note, in the old religion indigenous to Italy, it was believed that each region had its own deities and protective spirits. So to name Aeneas Jupiter Indiges, basically Aeneas indigenous Jupiter, was a huge honor. In essence, making him the protective god of the Latin people. It is said that the tomb actually laid empty, as his body was never recovered from the battlefield, and that he was actually lifted by the gods to paradise at the request of his mother, Venus. His son, at the moment of his death, was not of age yet, but his mother, Lavinia, who was his regent, managed to hold on to the throne for her son until he came of age, through sheer cunning and skill, as ancient sources mention. Livy does mention that he is not certain, as a matter of fact no one is, if Ascanius was Aeneas' son with Lavinia or with his first wife, the Trojan Creusa, as it was too long ago even for the Romans of the 1st century BCE. But it was of no consequence. Upon coming of age, Ascanius saw that Lavinium was a large, wealthy, prosperous and strong city. So he left his mother in charge of it, and he, with a host of Latins that were too numerous to live comfortably in Lavinium, set out to found a new settlement. And they went to the foot of the Albani mountain range and created a new city, Alba Longa. Alba Longa is very important to our story, so don't worry, I'm not just adding random information for no reason. Lavinium was said to have been so powerful and wealthy that the Etruscans and the Rutuli did not dare attack it, neither after Aeneas' death and during the regency, nor when Alba Longa was founded. They tried to just ignore the foundation of a new, larger city close to their borders. The Albula River was to be the natural boundary between the Latins and the Etruscans. Remember this name, as this will be interesting. Ascanius was succeeded by his son Silvius and many other kings. These people, both those in Alba Longa and those in Lavinium, are considered to be the old Latins, the original Latins. This will come into play later. I will make a very long story short. After Silvius, all kings who ruled in Alba Longa bore the name Silvius in one form or another. One of them, Tibernius, drowned in the Albula River, and the river was renamed Tiber. And this is the river that traverses Rome even today. Told you it will come in play later. One other king was struck by lightning, so Aventinus, his successor, immediately took over. He was buried on a hill that the people later called Aventinus. That hill is now part of Rome, and it retained its name, and later the name was given to a very important gate that led into Rome. The king named Amulius overthrew his older brother Numitor, and to make sure that his brother's lineage dies out, he tricked his niece Rea Silvia to become a priestess of the goddess Vesta and forever remain a virgin. She gave birth to twin boys shortly thereafter, and she told everyone that it was a virginal conception by the god Mars and that she was still pure as her vows forced her to be. Livy does mention that no one knew if this is what she believed, and she was a little confused of how it happened or how it works, or if she believed that by saying this, she and her children might be spared the rage of her uncle, Romulus. But Livy and the Romans of his time were not convinced of such occurrences, as it is impossible, I hope we can all agree. But alas, history is littered with virginal conceptions, all used perhaps to hide, infidelity, but it makes for a good story, and this is what we are here for, a good story. On the other hand, can you argue against, in let's say a deeply religious society, the idea that the god you are worshipping impregnated a woman? Go ahead and try. Be my guest. Many have tried to do so. But remember that many a god, especially Zeus, could not hold it in his pants. And he's said to have had many children with mortal women. And of course there were those who believed these stories, back then and perhaps even now. But there were many more who had a good laugh and just moved on. And we still believe in virginal conceptions, although they have never ever been recorded in humans. And even in antiquity, people had a hard time believing it. Scientifically, it is possible, by a mistake, that the ovum makes and provides all 46 chromosomes needed for conception instead of the normal 23 it provides, while the sperm provides the other 23. But only a handful of insects and small lizards and vertebrates are able to reproduce this way. Again, not humans, but I'm getting off track. Romulus threw Rea Silvia in the cellars and took the twins, placed them in a wicker basket and set them down the Tiber to drown. Now, this is where we're gonna take a break before we continue with the twins, who, if you haven't figured it out yet, are Romulus and Remus, our protagonists. Before we go to the miniature, hit that like button and show me you learned something new and found some value thus far in the video. Hit that subscribe button and join this growing funky community, and make sure the bell is on so you are notified when a new video comes out. And if you miss seeing my lovely assistants Mango and Potato, make sure you check out TW Creative -Cats, a channel that has nothing to do with history and everything to do with cat adventures. One of these days I will treat you with something nice. I will tell you the full names of my lovely assistants, but until then, let's talk about the miniature. With the miniature painted and the highlights added, it is now time for the details. Using PBO white, once again, I am painting what I try to represent as being some sort of ports on the body of the construct and on its neural spines. And I will also be painting the mouths of the vents in preparation for something special. I am also painting white all the damaged areas of the construct, all the scuffles and the cracks on its body. It will end up looking pretty banged up, and that is perfect. It has been through a lot. As you can see, I went with pretty intense highlights this time around, and thankfully I did not get a lot of paint on the gears, so cleaning them up will be quite easy. Because I want a little bit more flow when it comes to the finer cracks of the body of the creature, I'm switching to a white acrylic ink to make things easier. Okay, before the break we had the twins gently floating down the Tiber, or at least that was the order of the king. At that time, the Tiber flooded the plains around and large lagoons and ponds formed. The king's servant believed that if they set the twins in one of those ponds, they would eventually find their way to the Tiber and flow out to the sea. Thus, the twins ended up stuck on the edge of a marsh, with the servants reporting back that the deed was done. Legend has it that a she-wolf heard the cries of the twins as she was drinking water and found them. The she-wolf started feeding them with her milk and grooming them. Eventually, a shepherd by the name of Faustulus, who was employed by the king, stumbled upon the wolf and the twins and took the children home to his wife Lucretia. Now, this is where it gets even more interesting. We all know the legend of the wolf nursing the twins, and we all know the statue. If you don't, this is it. This statue is famous, at least here in Europe and even in the Americas. What the ancient Romans believed was that Lucretia was a prostitute who slept with the shepherds, with all of the shepherds her husband was working with. In Latin, lupa, plural lupe, was the word for both she-wolves and for prostitutes. Basically, prostitutes were called she-wolves. So when the legend says that the twins were nursed by a she-wolf, it is a matter of interpretation if we want to translate the word as a she-wolf or translate it as prostitute. But don't be under the impression that the Romans minded the idea of the twins being raised by a prostitute. Actually, they kinda took pride in it. The twins grew up around the shepherds and their flocks, but they weren't content with their lives. While in their teenage years, they started roaming the forest and hunting both wild animals and highwaymen, dividing their spoils with the shepherds. They thus became very skilled warriors and hunters. One year, during the celebration of Lupercalia, a pastoral festival, where youngsters would compete against each other, a group of highwaymen attacked the participants, targeting the twins, in revenge for being deprived of their spoils for so long. And they managed to capture Remus, while Romulus managed to push them back. The kidnappers took Remus before the king and accused him of being a pillager and a robber. The king threw him in chains and started interrogating him. In this interrogation, he learned that he was a twin, and based on his looks, age and mannerism, the king started suspecting that this was one of his nephews. While this was happening, Romulus organized the shepherds and had them arrive in Alba Longa over several days and taking different routes so as to not arouse suspicion. At his command, they stormed the palace and reached the king. At the same time, Remus also gained the support of some insiders in the palace. At the first sound of trouble, Numitor, the true king, rushed to the palace with a group of guards trying to defend it against attackers. Once arriving, he saw that the king, his brother, was dead and that the twins killed him. He recognized his grandchildren and they cheered him, reinstating him on his rightful throne. Once the dust settled, the twins wanted to found their own city, a city greater than both Lavinium and Alba Longa. The population of both cities was too numerous and they now had to take care of the shepherds as well. They chose the place where they were found by the she-wolf, a swamp next to 7 hills. Because they were identical, they could not choose between one another and they both wanted to be the sole ruler. They decided to let the gods choose between them through the flight of birds, as it was customary. They each chose a lookout position, Romulus on the Palatine Hill, while Remus on the Aventine Hill. The story goes that the gods showed Remus 6 eagles or aquillas. Later, the gods showed Romulus 12 eagles. Their people immediately split in two, some supporting Remus, saying that the gods showed the eagles to him first, while the others said that because Romulus saw 12, he was their ruler. A scuffle broke out, and in the scuffle, Remus was viciously hit and was killed. At least this is one of the legends. The other one, the one that the Romans tended to prefer, is that once Romulus saw the 12 eagles, he set out to establish the boundaries and the perimeter of the city, erecting very short walls just to mark out the future city. These walls, in ancient belief, were sacred. They were to be respected. They were the limit between the civilized and the uncivilized, the untamed, the dangerous world outside. Remus, in an attempt to humiliate and to mock his brother, jumped over those walls. This angered Romulus so much that he struck his brother and killed him, and over his body uttered the words, "Henceforth May anyone who climbs over walls that I build suffer the same fate. This is how Romulus became the first king of Rome, naming the city after himself. Once the first hill was fortified and the first purification rituals concluded, he set out to issue laws to unite his people. And to differentiate himself from mere citizens, he started dressing himself in beautiful garments and started being escorted everywhere he went by 12 lictors. There are two opinions regarding the lictors. The first is more of a legend, and it relates to the number of eagles he saw, thus choosing 12 individuals that represented the 12 eagles. But in Livy's opinion and that of his contemporaries, it was simply something Romulus adopted from the Etruscans, who had 12 settlements, each giving a representative to escort their ruler, thus 12. This wasn't the first thing nor the last thing that the Romans appropriated from the Etruscans, so it made more sense. To bolster the number of inhabitants of Rome, Romulus opened the city and made it a sanctuary for all those who were the tired, the poor, basically the huddled masses. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The city accepted anyone who wanted to come, be them free people or runaway slaves. The power of the new city grew day by day. The only problem was that they didn't have enough women. Romulus did not offer shelter in Rome for women, be them runaway or free, women who wanted to settle in the new city. It was not a sanctuary for women. To counterbalance this, he started sending out emissaries to all neighboring cities, but everywhere the Roman emissaries turned up, they were turned away with a simple question: why didn't you open the city to exiled women? This would have solved many of your problems. Seeing that they were getting nowhere, Romulus devised a plan. He organized a new set of celebrations called Consulia, dedicated to Neptunus Equester, close to Rome. He invited all of his neighbors, who flocked to the new city and were in awe at the sights of the massive buildings and temples. The people of the Sabines came with all their women and children to enjoy the celebrations. While the games were on and everybody was paying attention to what was going on, the Romans sprung their trap and kidnapped all women they could find and spirited them away to Rome, barring the gates behind them. We can all see where this is going, I hope. The families of the kidnapped women cursed the Romans and asked Neptunus to bring swift justice, as the Romans broke the sacred laws of hospitality. The families of those kidnapped were not equipped to lay siege to the city and were quickly driven off. Romulus, in a very creepy and disturbed way, is said to have visited each woman and tried to alleviate their pain and suffering by telling them to rejoice, as they will have children with the Romans and share the country and all goods. He told them that the blame lied with their families, as they refused to marry them with Romans. This is very disturbing, regardless of how you look at it. Gaslighting at its finest. We kidnapped you, we forced ourselves upon you, left you pregnant, but this is not our fault. It's your family's fault. They are to blame for this. They did not allow you to marry us, so we only did what we had to. This is beyond disturbing, but let's see what happens next. Of course, the families of the women sought to get them back and started pressuring their king to set out with the army. But because the tribes would not properly organize, considering that the others were moving too slow and laying blame at each other's feet, they set out separately to attack Rome. Romulus made swift work of their attempts, killed some of their rulers and even sacked some of their cities, left without able-bodied men. Romulus then built and dedicated a temple to Jupiter Feretrius and dedicated the weapons and armor of the fallen enemy king to Jupiter and left them there in the temple, calling them Spolia Opima, the most treasured of spoils. This happened only a handful of times in Roman history, that the armaments and the weapons and the garments of the enemy ruler were dedicated to Jupiter Feretrius in this particular temple. Now, after 2 more Roman victories, the kidnapped women begged Hersilia, Romulus' wife, to convince the king to invite their relatives to Rome to live there in peace. Romulus agreed happily, but not before clashing with the Sabines. Let's take another short break before returning to the Sabines and their attempts of recovering their kidnapped women. Let's go to the miniature. Now that all of the paint is dry, I am using chipping fluid from Ammo MIG for larger flat surfaces of the miniature, but because it is pretty banged up and because it's really weird, there aren't all that many flat large surfaces, so I am using it mostly on its neural spines. What I did not anticipate was that the fluid will make the ink used as a wash run again, but oh well, lessons learned. Until the chipping fluid is dry and I can add some paint on top of it, I will start making smoke columns for the vents using some fiber used for stuffed animals, and I am dipping it in grey ink. As you can see, I don't have any grey ink, so I'm making it by mixing black and white inks. Of course, the black is really intense, so a 50-50 ratio does not work at all. Initially I'm trying to apply the ink with a paintbrush, but eventually I ended up just dipping the fibers in the ink mixture and remembering what finger painting felt like. Let's continue. After seeing how 3 of their allied tribes were defeated, the Sabines came up with a plan. They bought off a young Roman woman, the daughter of an influent Roman. In return for opening the gates, she asked for what they were wearing on their left arm. So you understand, the Sabines usually wore golden armbands and very well crafted precious stone rings on their left hand and arms in battle. They agreed, she opened the gates to Rome, and they crushed her with their shields, worn on the left hand, as a warning to all traitors regardless of the side they were betraying. They gave her what she asked for. They gave her what they had on their left arm. They did not lie. The Sabines entered Rome and occupied the city's fortified hill, while Romulus and his army were busy defeating the tribes of women that they kidnapped. The next day, Romulus returned to Rome and found it occupied. The Sabines would not field their army, instead kept to the battlements, taunting the Romans to assault their own fortification. The Romans did so, but to no avail. Very long story short, the Romans fled the field at first, then Romulus intervened personally and swore to Jupiter to build a massive temple dedicated to the god and turned the tide of the battle. Seeing how they were slaying each other, the kidnapped Sabine women tore off their clothing, untied their hair, which was a huge thing, and with desperation ran between the 2 battle lines, ignoring arrow and spear, shield and sword. They managed to halt the battle and started begging their family and new husbands to stop fighting, as they would rather die than live as widows or without parents and siblings, as they were now wed to the Romans and bore their children and wanted their families with them, rejoicing. This actually worked. Imagine how fucked up this is. They were either brainwashed or had a very severe of the Stockholm Syndrome after all they've been subjected to at the hands of the Romans. They threw themselves between the battle lines and had their families, who mind you came to get them back, stop fighting their abusers and kidnappers. Fucked up. And somehow they blamed themselves and told their families that if they wanted to punish anyone and hold somebody accountable, they should punish them for some reason. In the end, the 2 sides agreed to make peace and unite the 2 cities and the 2 people with the seat of power in Rome. In honor of the women who stopped the bloodshed, the people were divided in 30 curiae, 30 tribes more or less. Let's call them tribes. Livy does not know if the 13 names were drawn by lot or selected to reflect the status of the most respected women or what. Seeing how there were clearly more than 30 women in Rome. This was the moment when 3 cavalry centuries were also created. For a bit of context, horses were insanely expensive in antiquity, so the ewites, or knights, had to provide their own horses and harnesses and everything. Only the wealthy were able to afford horses, and thus they became the ewites, the Roman middle upper class or lower upper class. The Romans also took a new name to honor and appease the Sabines, that of virines. This might come from the Sabine word for spear, but it is unclear, even to Livy. The 3 cavalry centuries were the Ramnenses, named after Romulus, Titienses, after Tatius, the Sabine king, and Lucares, with an unknown origin. Perhaps it was a noble individual or the head of a prominent family that managed to sponsor a wing of cavalry. Romulus and Tatius both ruled in harmony from Rome, as legend has it. Ironic, isn't it? Romulus killed his own brother because he wanted to rule alone. And now he had to make friends with the king who occupied the fortress he built, humiliated him, and had to share power. Eventually, Tatius was killed during a revolt a few years later, following a dispute between 2 tribes, a Sabine tribe and one from Lavinium. Romulus was not too heartbroken about this. Again, he was the sole ruler of a very strong and powerful people. What followed were a few more battles with the neighboring cities and a few more victories for the Romans. He was beloved by the people and the army, but not by the Senate. He was constantly surrounded by 300 armed soldiers called Celeres, the Swift. This could easily go in a fantasy setting. After a reign of 40 years, he was one day inspecting the army near the Capri swamp. A sudden storm erupted and engulfed the king with thunder and lightning, with the wind howling. As suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving no trace of the king. The people believed the senators who were witnessed to this when they said that the king was taken by the gods themselves and made one of them, and thus he took the name Virinus. It is said the people sat in silence for a while, and then they started encouraging one another to cheer for Romulus, the god, the son of God, the protector of Rome and the Virinus. Of course, the rumor that the senators were behind the murder spread, but in dark corners, not in the open. At the same time, in Rome there was a famous and very influential man by the name of Proculus Iulius, who was such a great orator that everybody believed anything he said, regardless of how implausible it was or it sounded. He walked among the mourners and told them that very morning Romulus descended from the heavens and stood before Proculus. Proculus fell to his knees and asked Romulus if he could gaze upon the face of his king one last time. Romulus the god agreed, and he told Proculus to stand up. Then he said, "Go forth and tell my people that the gods want them to make my Rome the capital of the whole world. That they should master war. Tell them to remember and to teach their children that no mortal power will be able to stand against the might of Rome." And with that, Romulus vanished into the blue yonder, leaving Proculus stunned in awe. For some reason, people believed him, and the word spread further. I guess I understand why they believed it. They really wanted for their king to be among the gods and not lay at the bottom of some lake or some pit or float down the Tiber to the sea. I guess I see it. With both Romulus and Tatius gone, Rome was left without a leader. And because the senators could not agree who should rule them, they divided in 10 decuriae and from each centurie selected a representative. There were thus 10 senators who would each rule 5 days, with only one of them holding the signs of power and rule over the 12 lictors during those 5 days. This went on for a whole year. Soon enough, the people started mumbling and grumbling, saying that now instead of one master, they had 10. The Sabines at the same time were afraid that they would no longer be represented with their king Tatius, now long dead, and Romulus gone, Romulus who kinda accepted them. The people became restless, and the senators realized that they had to give up willingly what they were about to lose unwillingly. They allowed the people to elect the next king, but only after they had a very long and good think about it and came to a conclusion. Interesting system, isn't it? Even in Livy's time, he says that the Roman Senate allowed the people to vote on issues that were already decided, so that the people were content and felt that they had an actual word in the politics of the city. Thank goodness this is no longer the case, at least not in most countries around the world. The senators came out and decreed that the people should choose Romulus as successor. The people rejoiced at the power they were given, and they decided only one thing: that the Senate should choose the next king. Nice reverse psychology, I'll give them that. In that time, there was a renowned master of law, both mortal and divine, who lived in Cures and was a Sabine, Numa Pompilius. He was believed to be an apprentice of Pythagoras, but this is not likely at all, even in Livy's opinion. The senators knew that naming one among themselves would not look good in the eyes of the people, and knew that naming a Roman would not be good because the Sabines and the other smaller tribes would revolt. So they decided to name Numa Pompilius, a Sabine, as king. Following Romulus's example, Numa asked for a sign from the gods, if he was looked upon favorably to take the throne. Before entering Rome, he sat on a stone overlooking the city and asked for an augurus, a priest, to interpret the signs from the gods. The priest drew a line in the sky from south to north and then divided in two, resulting in 4 quadrants. He placed his right hand on Numa's head and in his left hand held a wooden staff. He asked Jupiter for a sign and he received it, confirming Numa as king. And with that, Numa Pompilius walked in the city of Rome and took his place on the throne as the second king of the Romans. To be honest, I liked the idea of having a ruler elected among almost random people so much that I kinda made it canon in my world with a few tweaks. On Eresal, my world, the ruler of the Aemar Empire, the place where the action is now taking place, upon sensing their approaching death, would set out in the empire and search for their successor. Fate would guide them. The empire knew what it needed, so the successor could be anyone from the daughter of a former enemy ruler to a common thief, to a lowly guardsman, to a prominent philosopher. The dying ruler would select, the council would take care of the legal works, and the people would rejoice. Now, with some information about my world also given, let us take one last look at the miniature before we wrap things up. I realized early on that the fiber I dyed would not be stiff enough to simply stick to the side of the miniature, so I added some supports in the form of pieces of toothpicks. Superglue does not stick toothpicks to XPS foam, if you were ever wondering, so I had to add a dollop of Mod Podge in the vents, each and every one of them, stick the toothpicks in and wait for everything to dry. Now that they are set in place, I am using the green-yellow ink to paint the vents and the supports. This time, Superglue does a pretty okay job, not stellar, but good enough. I am putting a lot of Superglue on the supports and then wrapping the small columns around them. Of course, it couldn't have been easy and just stick the base of the smokes to the supports. The fiber was pretty compacted thanks to the ink, but using a toothpick I managed to create openings. Of course, it later occurred to me that I should have just stuffed the base of the smoke columns in the vents while they were still wet. Another lesson learned. To finish everything off, I am painting the base of the smoke columns in yellow-green ink to give the impression of it being lit from below or from within the construct. this is where we are going to leave the story for now. Next time we'll talk about Numa Pompilius and the next 2 kings, hopefully, as I really don't want to cram 6 kings in the span of 40 or 45 minutes. Oh, by the way, a few years back an empty sarcophagus was found in the Roman Forum in the center of the city, and there are some researchers who believe that this was a cenotaph, a place of worship for the Roman king Romulus and god Quirinus. Of course, there are those who do not support this idea, but there were also skeletal remains found buried in the banks of the Tiber that matched the timeline, but seeing how the Tiber was long used to execute people, the remains could have been anyone's, but the earliest layer of occupation of the area that now Rome is in has been found and predates Romulus and Remus by a lot. And when I say a lot, the earliest evidence of the 7 hills, or at least some of the 7 hills being inhabited, dates from 12,000 BCE. Not 1200, 12,000. But in the 8th century BCE, the period in which the Romans believed that Romulus and Remus were alive, the area, or even perhaps the city itself, if it existed, knew a period of rapid expansion and growth. Oh, and by the way, the date at which Rome was supposedly founded is April 21st, with 753 BCE being the accepted date, but there are very many alternatives. But I won't go into that today. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for the privilege of your time, and I truly hope that you found some inspiration and learned something new today. I can't wait to see you all funky people here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of mini painting, history, world building, trivia, and even cats if we are all lucky. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed this video. Oh, and remember that to every legend there might be a grain of truth somewhere in there, so who knows if there isn't a little bit of truth to the legend of the twins Romulus and Remus. Remember, be curious, take inspiration from the past, and never stop world building and creating awesome things, whatever those are. Your mind and imagination are amazing, and don't let anybody else tell you otherwise. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers. Ascanius was succeeded by his son. Ascanius was succeeded by his old the one king Amulius.